The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Suffolk County Courthouse in downtown Boston, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge William Barrett adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another busy day in courtroom 4A. At 62 years old, with graying hair and stern blue eyes, he had earned a reputation for running the tightest courtroom in Massachusetts. "All rise," the court officer announced as Judge Barrett entered precisely at 9 a.m. The assembled crowd of lawyers, defendants, and observers rose to their feet. The judge's leather chair creaked as he settled behind the imposing oak bench, surveying the courtroom with practiced authority. As he began reviewing the morning's first case, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a slight squeak. Judge Barrett looked up, his eyes narrowing at the disruption. A young black woman in a navy blue suit was quietly making her way toward the front rows. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she tried to minimize the disturbance. Judge Barrett's jaw tightened. If there was one thing he couldn't tolerate, it was tardiness in his courtroom. He had made examples of latecomers before, regardless of their status or position. The woman's professional appearance and confident bearing did nothing to soften his response. "Approach the bench," he commanded, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere. The woman paused, then walked forward with measured steps. She carried a leather briefcase and maintained perfect posture, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "Your Honor, I apologize for my late arrival. There was an emergency," she began, her voice calm and articulate. "Silence," Judge Barrett interrupted, his tone sharp. "What's your name?" "Dr. Kimberly Washington," she replied, maintaining her composure despite his hostile demeanor. The judge's eyes swept over her dismissively. "Dr. Washington, this court begins promptly at 9 a.m., not 9:05, not 9:03. Your tardiness shows disrespect for this institution and everyone present." A few whispers rippled through the courtroom. Dr. Washington opened her mouth to explain, but Judge Barrett raised his hand to silence her again. The morning light caught his golden watch as he gestured, a symbol of his decades of authority. "I'm holding you in contempt of court," he declared. "The fine is $200, to be paid by the end of business today." Dr. Washington's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in her dark eyes. She reached for her briefcase, presumably to retrieve documentation, but Judge Barrett had already turned his attention back to his docket. "Your Honor, if I may," she tried once more. "You may not," he cut her off. "Pay the fine at the clerk's office. This is not up for discussion. Take a seat or leave my courtroom." The assembled crowd watched as Dr. Washington stood perfectly still for a moment, her hands still resting on her briefcase. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated her face, highlighting both her youth and her dignity. Several attorneys present exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. Court Officer James Martinez, who had worked in this courtroom for 15 years, felt a growing unease as he observed the scene. Something about Dr. Washington's demeanor suggested this situation was more complicated than it appeared, but years of experience had taught him not to interfere with Judge Barrett's decisions. Dr. Washington finally took a seat in the front row, removing a laptop from her briefcase. She began typing quietly, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Judge Barrett glanced at her with irritation, but continued with the morning's proceedings. The next case involved a routine traffic violation, but the judge found himself distracted by the woman's presence. There was something about her calm acceptance of his punishment that bothered him, though he couldn't quite identify why. In his 30 years on the bench, he had learned to trust his instincts about people, but Dr. Washington was proving difficult to read. Little did Judge Barrett know, his hasty decision would soon come back to challenge everything he thought he knew about authority, prejudice, and justice. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, its rays illuminating the words carved above his bench: "Equal justice under law." As the morning session continued, Dr. Kimberly Washington sat quietly in the front row, occasionally glancing at her phone. The device kept buzzing with urgent messages from her staff at the State House, where an important education bill awaited her vote. But here she was, stuck in courtroom 4A, waiting for the right moment to clear up this embarrassing misunderstanding. Sarah Chen, the court clerk with 20 years of experience, couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen Dr. Washington somewhere before. She kept looking at the young woman while organizing the day's files, trying to place the familiar face. The morning news played in her mind, something about a historic election and a new committee chair. The courtroom doors opened again, and a breathless young man in a wrinkled suit hurried in. He spotted Dr. Washington and quickly made his way to her side. "Representative Washington," he whispered urgently, "the vote has been moved up. They need you at the State House right now." Judge Barrett's head snapped up at the word representative. He had been in the middle of reviewing a minor traffic violation when the whispered conversation reached his ears. His steel-gray eyebrows furrowed as he watched the interaction. "Quiet in the court," he commanded, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Dr. Washington rose from her seat, gathering her belongings. This time, she didn't wait for permission to approach the bench. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I apologize for the interruption, but I need to address the matter of the contempt charge before I leave." "I've already ruled on that matter, Ms. Washington," Judge Barrett replied, emphasizing the Ms. with a touch of irritation. "That's Representative Dr. Washington," her assistant corrected automatically, then immediately shrank back when the judge glared at him. Sarah Chen's eyes suddenly widened with recognition. She quickly grabbed a newspaper from her desk and rushed it to Judge Barrett. There, on the front page of the Boston Globe, was a photograph of Dr. Kimberly Washington, the youngest black woman ever elected to the state legislature and the newly appointed chair of the Judiciary Oversight Committee. The color drained from Judge Barrett's face as he looked from the newspaper to the woman standing before him. The courtroom had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene. "Your Honor," Dr. Washington spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I was late this morning because I was meeting with the governor about the education reform bill that's being voted on today. I tried to explain this earlier, but wasn't given the opportunity." Judge Barrett's hands gripped the edge of his bench. In his 30 years on the bench, few moments had made him feel as small as this one. The morning sun that had seemed so welcoming earlier now felt harsh and revealing. "I respect this court and its protocols," Dr. Washington continued, "but I also believe in the importance of fair hearing and equal treatment. The contempt charge concerns me not because of the fine, but because of what it represents: a rush to judgment without proper consideration." The young legislative assistant shifted nervously beside her, checking his watch. "Representative, the vote." Dr. Washington held up her hand, silencing him without taking her eyes off the judge. "Your Honor, I oversee the committee that reviews judicial conduct in our state. I would very much like to have a longer conversation about what transpired here today, but right now, I have a responsibility to my constituents to be present for an important vote." Judge Barrett sat frozen in his chair, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching him. His years of experience hadn't prepared him for this situation. The weight of his earlier dismissive treatment of Dr. Washington pressed heavily on his conscience. "The contempt charge is dismissed," he finally managed, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Representative Washington, we should indeed discuss this matter further." Dr. Washington nodded gracefully. "I'll have my office contact yours to arrange a meeting." With that, she turned and strode toward the exit, her assistant hurrying beside her. As the doors closed behind her, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Barrett stared at the newspaper still lying on his bench, the bold headline seeming to mock his morning's decisions. "Rising Star in Legislature Takes on Justice Reform." Sarah Chen returned to her desk, hiding a small smile. Sometimes, she thought, justice worked in unexpected ways. The news spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone from security guards to senior judges had heard about Judge Barrett's confrontation with Representative Dr. Washington. As he sat alone in his chambers, the morning's newspaper lay untouched on his desk, Dr. Washington's photo facing upward. Linda Thompson, his secretary of 15 years, knocked gently before entering with a stack of messages. "Judge, the media is calling. The Boston Globe, Channel 5 News, and several others want your comment on this morning's incident." Judge Barrett rubbed his temples, feeling every bit of his 62 years. "No comments," he said quietly, unusually subdued. His usual commanding presence had deflated since the morning's events. "There's more," Linda continued hesitantly. "The Chief Justice wants to see you immediately." The walk to Chief Justice Morgan's office felt longer than usual. Court staff members quickly looked away as Judge Barrett passed, their whispered conversations falling silent. You could feel their eyes on his back as he walked by. Chief Justice Patricia Morgan, a stern woman with silver hair and decades of experience, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Sit down, Bill," she said as soon as he entered. "Do you realize what a mess you created?" "Pat, I had no idea who she was," Judge Barrett began. "That's exactly the problem." Chief Justice Morgan interrupted sharply. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with respect and fairness. Dr. Washington isn't just any state representative. She's the chair of the committee that oversees judicial appointments and conduct." She pushed a tablet across her desk, showing a video that was already going viral on social media. Someone in the courtroom had recorded the entire incident. Judge Barrett watched himself dismissively cutting off Dr. Washington, his face growing warmer with each passing second. The timing couldn't be worse. Chief Justice Morgan continued. "The Judiciary Budget Review is next month, and Dr. Washington's committee holds the purse strings. But more importantly, Bill, this incident raises serious questions about bias in our courts." Outside the office, reporters have begun gathering in the courthouse lobby. Sarah Chen, the court clerk who had recognized Dr. Washington, was being interviewed by a local news station. "It was uncomfortable to watch," she told a reporter. Dr. Washington maintained her dignity throughout the entire incident, even when she wasn't being heard. It makes you wonder how many other people get silenced in our courtrooms every day. Back in the Chief Justice's office, Judge Barrett sat quietly as his superior continued speaking. "Dr. Washington's office called. Instead of filing a formal complaint, she's requesting a meeting to discuss implementing new anti-bias training programs for the judiciary." "She wants to meet? After how I treated her?" Judge Barrett asked, surprised. "Yes, and you should be thankful for her grace," Chief Justice Morgan replied. "She's turning this personal slight into an opportunity for institutional improvement. That's what real leadership looks like, Bill." A knock at the door interrupted them. Linda entered with an urgent expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you both need to see this. Dr. Washington is giving a press conference at the State House." They turned to the television mounted on the wall. Dr. Washington stood at a podium, looking poised and professional. Behind her, the education reform bill she'd helped pass that morning was being celebrated, but reporters were more interested in the courthouse incident. "Yes, there was an unfortunate interaction this morning." Dr. Washington addressed the questions calmly. "But I don't want to focus on that single incident. Instead, I want to discuss the larger issues it represents. How many of our citizens face similar treatment in courtrooms across our state? How many don't have the privilege of a title to protect them?" Judge Barrett watched, his throat tight, as she continued. "I've already reached out to the court to schedule a meeting. This isn't about one judge or one incident. It's about making our justice system truly just for everyone." Chief Justice Morgan turned off the television. "She's given you a way forward, Bill. Don't waste this opportunity to make things right." Judge Barrett nodded slowly, finally understanding the full impact of his actions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Chief Justice's office, reminiscent of the prison bars their decisions sometimes put people behind. Today, those shadows felt like a reminder of the power they held, and the responsibility that came with it. The meeting between Judge Barrett and Dr. Washington was scheduled for Friday morning at the courthouse. As the judge waited in the conference room, his hands fidgeted with his reading glasses. The morning newspapers still carried stories about the incident, with headlines analyzing what it meant for the justice system. Mary Rodriguez, the courthouse diversity coordinator, sat beside him with a thick folder of training materials. "Remember, Judge Barrett," she said gently, "this is an opportunity for positive change, not a punishment." At exactly 9:00 a.m., Dr. Washington arrived, perfectly on time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. She brought with her two people, James Carter, a civil rights attorney, and Dr. Lisa Chen, an expert in institutional bias training. "Thank you for meeting with us, Your Honor," Dr. Washington began, her voice professional but warm. She wore a deep purple suit today, and her presence commanded attention, just as it had in the courtroom earlier that week. Judge Barrett cleared his throat. "Representative Washington, I owe you an apology. My behavior was unacceptable, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you." "I appreciate that, Judge Barrett," she replied, opening her laptop. "But as I said at the press conference, this isn't just about me. Let me share something with you." She turned her screen around, showing a collection of emails she'd received since the incident. These are stories from people who've experienced similar treatment in courtrooms across our state, people who didn't have titles or positions to protect them. As she read excerpts from the emails, Judge Barrett's face grew increasingly troubled. Stories of people being dismissed, interrupted, or treated with suspicion based on their appearance filled the room. Each account felt like a personal rebuke of the system he'd served for 3 decades. A young mother was given a harsh fine for being 5 minutes late because her babysitter didn't show up. Dr. Washington Reed. An elderly immigrant was mocked for his accent while trying to explain his case. A black teenager was assumed to be a defendant when he was actually there to receive a community service award. The room fell silent as she closed her laptop. Dr. Lisa Chen spoke up. These experiences create a ripple effect. People lose faith in the justice system. They stop believing they'll be treated fairly. That's why today's meeting is so important. James Carter, the civil rights attorney, spread out several documents on the table. We developed a comprehensive training program, he explained. But we need judges like you, Judge Barrett, to champion it from within the system. Judge Barrett picked up one of the documents, studying it carefully. You want me to lead this initiative? He asked, surprised. Dr. Washington nodded. Sometimes, the most powerful advocates for change are those who recognize their own need to change. Your experience, combined with this new perspective, could make a real difference. Mary Rodriguez jumped in excitedly. We could start with a pilot program in this courthouse, then expand it across the state. As they discussed the details, Judge Barrett found himself growing more engaged. The training program would include workshops on unconscious bias, cultural competency, and communication skills. Every court employee, from judges to security officers, would participate. There's one more thing, Dr. Washington said, pulling out a final document. I'd like you to join me in writing an article about this experience for the Bar Association Journal. Complete honesty about what happened, what we learned, and how we're working to improve. Judge Barrett stared at the document for a long moment. Writing about his mistakes publicly went against every instinct he had, but as he looked around the room at these people working to improve the system he loved, he realized this was bigger than his pride. I'll do it, he said firmly. But I want to add something to the training program. We need to include random courtroom audits, where observers check for bias in real time. Dr. Washington smiled, the first real smile she'd shown since the incident. That's an excellent suggestion, Judge Barrett. This is exactly the kind of collaboration we need. As the meeting wrapped up, Mary Rodriguez couldn't help but feel optimistic. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into a movement for real change. Outside the conference room, the daily business of the courthouse continued. But inside, something important had shifted. Sometimes, the best changes came from the most uncomfortable moments. 2 weeks after the meeting, the courthouse buzzed with activity as the new training program began. Judge Barrett stood at the front of the main conference room, facing a packed audience of judges, clerks, bailiffs, and other court staff. His hands were steady now, unlike the trembling he'd felt during that first meeting with Dr. Washington. Many of you know why we're here today, he began, his voice carrying the same authority it held in his courtroom, but with a new touch of humility. 2 weeks ago, I made a serious mistake. I let my biases affect how I treated someone in my courtroom. The room was silent. In the back, Sarah Chen, the clerk who had first recognized Dr. Washington, sat with her notebook ready. Next to her, Court Officer James Martinez leaned forward, surprised to hear the usually proud judge speaking so openly about his mistakes. Dr. Lisa Chen took over, setting up her presentation. Today's session isn't about shame or blame, she explained. It's about recognition and growth. We all have biases. The key is learning to recognize and manage them. As the training progressed, stories began emerging from around the room. A young bailiff admitted he often watched black visitors more closely than others. An elderly judge confessed to being less patient with non-English speakers. Each admission created space for more honesty. During the lunch break, Judge Barrett checked his phone and found a message from Dr. Washington. Their jointly written article for the Bar Association Journal had just been published online. His stomach tightened as he clicked the link. The article, titled Justice Begins with Self-Reflection, A Judge's Journey, was already generating hundreds of comments. Some praised their honesty, while others criticized him harshly. But one comment caught his eye. This is what accountability looks like. Mary Rodriguez, the diversity coordinator, rushed up to him with excitement. "Judge, you won't believe this. 5 other courthouses have called asking about implementing our training program. Dr. Washington's office is being flooded with requests." Back in the afternoon session, Dr. Lisa Chen led an exercise about snap judgments. She showed photos of different people and asked participants to write down their first impressions. The results were eye-opening. "Look at how many of us assumed the man in the suit was a lawyer," she pointed out, while the same man in casual clothes was assumed to be a defendant. These are the unconscious biases we need to challenge. Judge Barrett watched his colleagues' faces as understanding dawned. He remembered his own moment of realization, how it felt to see his prejudices laid bare. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Later that afternoon, a surprise visitor arrived. Dr. Washington stepped quietly into the back of the room, nodding encouragingly as Judge Barrett led a discussion about communication strategies. Her presence reminded everyone why they were there. During a break, she pulled Judge Barrett aside. "The governor's office called," she said. "They want to make this training mandatory for all state courthouses. They're asking us to lead the initiative." Judge Barrett adjusted his reading glasses, a habit he'd developed when processing important information. "Us?" he asked. "Yes, us," Dr. Washington confirmed. "Your perspective as someone who's gone through this transformation is valuable. People need to see that change is possible." As the day's session wrapped up, Mary Rodriguez distributed evaluation forms. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many participants requesting additional sessions. One anonymous comment read, "For the first time, I'm really thinking about how my actions affect others in the courthouse." That evening, as Judge Barrett packed up his materials, he found a note on his desk from Sarah Chen. "My cousin had a case in your courtroom today. She said you listened to her story about being late, really listened. You're already changing, Your Honor." He carefully folded the note and put it in his wallet. Outside his window, the sunset painted the courthouse steps in warm colors. People were leaving for the day, their conversations animated, still processing what they'd learned. As he walked to his car, Judge Barrett passed the words carved above the courthouse entrance: "Equal justice under law." For the first time in his career, he felt like he truly understood what those words demanded of him. 1 month after the training program began, Judge Barrett sat in his office reviewing the latest round of courtroom observation reports. The changes in the courthouse were noticeable, but today would bring their biggest challenge yet: a press conference to announce the statewide expansion of their bias training program. "Judge, they're ready for your microphone check," Linda Thompson said, poking her head into his office. She couldn't help but smile at the sight of her boss practicing his speech for the 10th time that morning. The courthouse's main lobby had been transformed into a media center. Cameras and microphones filled the space where people usually passed through security. Dr. Washington stood near the podium, discussing last-minute details with the governor's staff. "Everyone seems nervous," Court Officer James Martinez commented to Sarah Chen as they watched reporters file in. "Except for Representative Washington. She looks as calm as ever." Sarah nodded. "Did you see today's numbers? Complaints about unfair treatment in our courthouse have dropped by 40% since the training started." At exactly 10:00 a.m., the press conference began. Governor Phillips stepped up to the podium first. 1 month ago, an incident in this courthouse sparked a crucial conversation about bias in our justice system. Today, we're turning that conversation into action. Dr. Washington spoke next, her purple blazer standing out against the courthouse's marble columns. "Change doesn't always come from grand gestures," she said. "Sometimes it comes from people willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to correct them." When it was Judge Barrett's turn to speak, he left his prepared notes folded in his pocket. "A month ago, I thought I was one of the good ones," he began honestly. "I believed that because I followed the law, I was automatically fair. I was wrong." He continued, his voice growing stronger. "True justice requires more than knowing the law. It requires us to recognize our biases, challenge our assumptions, and listen, really listen, to every person who enters our courts." The cameras flashed as he described the changes they'd implemented: regular bias training sessions, anonymous feedback systems, courtroom observers, and monthly review meetings where staff could discuss challenging situations. But the most significant change, he added, has been in how we see ourselves and our responsibility to the community we serve. During the question and answer session, a young reporter raised her hand. Judge Barrett, do you regret how you treated Representative Washington that day? The room grew quiet. Dr. Washington watched him carefully as he considered his response. I regret my actions that day, he said slowly, but I'm grateful for what they taught me. Dr. Washington could have demanded my resignation. Instead, she showed me a better path forward. After the press conference, as the media packed up their equipment, Mary Rodriguez rushed over with exciting news. 3 more states have contacted us about implementing our program. They want to send observers to see how we're doing it. In the courthouse cafeteria during lunch, Judge Barrett overheard 2 young lawyers discussing their morning cases. Did you notice how different it feels now? One said. The judges actually take time to understand our clients' situations. Later that afternoon, Dr. Washington stopped by Judge Barrett's chambers. She carried a thick folder of new initiatives they developed together. The Judicial Review Board wants us to present at their annual conference, she announced. They think our program could become a national model. Judge Barrett looked up from his desk, where he'd been reviewing case files with a new perspective. A month ago, I would have said our justice system was fine as it was, he admitted. Now I see how much work we still have to do. Dr. Washington smiled. That's exactly why you're the right person to help lead this change. You've lived both sides of the story. As they discussed the conference plans, Linda interrupted with an urgent message. A young mother had arrived late for her hearing, apologizing profusely about her broken-down car. Send her in, Judge Barrett said immediately. And Linda, please get her some water and find out if she needs any other assistance. Dr. Washington watched this interaction with approval. Small moments, she said quietly. That's where real change begins. The afternoon sun streamed through the chamber windows, illuminating the new poster on Judge Barrett's wall. It read, Justice is not just about what we do, but how we do it. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Judge Barrett stood before a packed auditorium at the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. Behind him, a large screen displayed statistics from their courthouse's transformation. Complaints down by 60%, public trust ratings up by 45%, and over 20 states now implementing similar programs. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, the conference director announced. A man who, along with Representative Dr. Washington, has revolutionized how we think about bias in our courts, Judge William Barrett. As he approached the podium, Judge Barrett remembered how different things had been just half a year ago. His hands no longer shook when he spoke about that day. Instead, he felt a quiet determination to share their story. Before I begin, he said, adjusting his reading glasses, I want to tell you about Maria Gonzalez. The audience leaned forward, curious about this unexpected opening. Last week, Maria came to my courtroom 15 minutes late. 6 months ago, I would have immediately fined her for tardiness. Instead, I asked why she was late. He paused, letting the moment sink in. She had walked 3 miles to the courthouse because her babysitter canceled and she couldn't afford a taxi. In the front row, Dr. Washington nodded encouragingly. She had flown in specifically for his speech, despite her busy legislative schedule. We didn't just waive any penalties, Judge Barrett continued. Our new court support system helped her connect with affordable childcare resources. That's what justice really looks like, understanding people's circumstances before making judgments. He clicked to the next slide, showing their training program's key components. But change isn't easy, he admitted. In the beginning, some of our staff resisted. They said we were being too soft, too accommodating. From her seat, Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to head court clerk, remembered those early days. She had traveled with Judge Barrett to share the administrative perspective of their changes. Then something remarkable happened, Judge Barrett went on. As we started listening to people's stories, our jobs became more meaningful. We weren't just processing cases, we were helping people navigate a complex system. He shared examples. The veteran with PTSD who needed a quiet space to calm down before his hearing, the single father who required an afternoon slot because of his children's school schedule, the elderly woman who needed help understanding her paperwork. These aren't special favors, he emphasized. This is what equal justice under law actually means, making sure everyone has a fair chance to be heard. During the question and answer session, a judge from Texas raised his hand. But doesn't this slow everything down? We have packed dockets as it is. Dr. Washington stepped up to the microphone. Actually, our efficiency has improved. When people feel heard and respected, cases move more smoothly. We have fewer appeals, fewer complaints, and better compliance with court orders. Back in their home courthouse, Mary Rodriguez was leading a training session for new employees. On the wall behind her hung photos from their journey, the first training day, the press conference, the governor signing their program into state law. The best part, Judge Barrett told the conference audience, is how these changes ripple outward. Other institutions in our city are now examining their own practices. Police departments, schools, government offices, they're all asking how they can do better. He showed a final slide, a simple photo of the courthouse entrance, where a new sign had been installed. "Welcome to your courthouse," it read in multiple languages. "Every story matters here." 6 months ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career, Judge Barrett concluded. Instead, thanks to Dr. Washington's wisdom and forgiveness, it became the beginning of something extraordinary. The applause was thunderous. As people lined up to ask questions afterward, Dr. Washington touched Judge Barrett's arm. "Look at your hands," she said softly. He looked down, surprised to realize they were perfectly steady. Gone was the nervous energy that had plagued him for so long. In its place was a quiet confidence, not in his authority, but in his ability to learn and grow. Outside the conference hall, justice was still a work in progress. But inside thousands of courtrooms across the country, something was shifting. One story, one change, one moment of understanding at a time. 1 year to the day after the incident, Judge Barrett sat in his chambers looking at 2 framed photographs on his wall. The first showed him finding Dr. Washington, captured by a courtroom observer, a reminder of where it all began. The second showed him and Dr. Washington at last week's National Justice Reform Awards, where their program had received the highest honor for institutional change. "Your 9:30 is here, Judge," Linda Thompson announced, smiling as she noticed him looking at the photos. She'd been his secretary for 16 years now, but the past year had shown her a side of him she'd never seen before. "Send them in, Linda," he replied, turning to face his visitor, a young judge from California who had flown in to observe their courthouse's transformation firsthand. "I have to admit," the visiting judge said after introductions, "when I first heard about your program, I was skeptical, but your results are impossible to ignore." Judge Barrett nodded, remembering his own initial resistance to change. "Let me show you something," he said, pulling out a thick binder. "These are letters from people who've come through our courthouse this year." He opened to a market page and read. "Dear Judge Barrett, yesterday I was late to court because my son was sick. Instead of being punished, I was asked if I needed help finding medical care. This is the first time I felt like the justice system cared about me as a person." Down in the main courthouse lobby, Sarah Chen was giving a tour to new court employees. "Notice our welcome desk," she pointed out. "We now have staff who speak 6 different languages. No one gets lost or confused in our courthouse anymore." Court Officer James Martinez, now the head of security training, demonstrated their new approach. "We don't just watch people," he explained to his team. "We welcome them. Security isn't just about protection, it's about making people feel safe and respected." In her State House office, Dr. Washington was reviewing the latest data with her staff. The program had spread to over 30 states, and international delegations were starting to visit. But what made her proudest was the individual stories of change. Back in his chambers, Judge Barrett received an unexpected call. "The President's Council on Justice Reform wants to meet with us." Dr. Washington's voice came through the speaker. "They're considering making our program a federal requirement." "Who would have thought," he replied, "that one difficult morning could lead to all this?" That afternoon, Judge Barrett presided over a naturalization ceremony, his favorite juvie now. As new citizens took their oaths, he noticed how different the courthouse felt. The stern portraits of old judges still hung on the walls, but between them were new artwork and photographs reflecting the community they served. Mary Rodriguez burst into his chambers after the ceremony, excitement written all over her face. "Judge, you won't believe this. Harvard Law School wants to make our program a required case study for all future judges. Later that day, the courthouse staff gathered for their monthly community feedback session. People from all walks of life shared their experiences, good and bad, and suggested improvements. Judge Barrett sat quietly, listening to every voice. A young woman stood up to speak. Last year, I was terrified to come to court because I didn't speak English well. Today, I'm here to volunteer as a language helper for others like me. As the session ended, Dr. Washington arrived for their regular strategy meeting. They had developed an easy friendship over the past year. Their initial confrontation transformed into a powerful partnership for change. "Do you ever wonder," she asked him, "what would have happened if I hadn't been an elected official that day?" Judge Barrett looked thoughtful. "I think about that every day," he replied. "It reminds me of all the people who didn't have your platform to challenge unfair treatment." Together, they walked through the courthouse halls. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the new mission statement they'd installed. Justice through understanding. Outside, a group of law students toured the building, learning about its transformation. Their guide pointed to a small plaque near the entrance that read, "Change begins with one moment of recognition, grows through countless acts of understanding, and lives on in every life it touches." As the day ended, Judge Barrett gathered his things to leave. On his desk lay tomorrow's docket, each case representing not just a number, but a person with a story to be heard. The courthouse had become more than a place of law. It was now a place of true justice.